Welcome back to another episode of Disney Unpacked, and today we're going to start the show with a piece of ancient history.
Len, the first words out of your mouth are we're opening the show with an ancient history bit, and bang, I appear. My self-esteem just went into the toilet, man. Anyway, we're going to talk about ancient video. Look at this and tell me, what do you see?
That looks like that's Tinkerbell flying over Sleeping Beauty Castle, the scene that we all know and love.
Very good. And tell me, Mr. Hill, what do you see?
We're looking at a 70-year-old woman who's sliding down a nearly 80-foot-long piece of wire at 30 miles an hour, who's about to smash into a mattress that's being held up by two burly cast members somewhere backstage.
Your description is both unexpectedly graphic and vaguely disturbing. I see something completely different when I watch the video. I see the very first stunt show to be regularly scheduled in a Disney theme park. And the cable, not a wire, was strung from the top of the 146-foot tall Matterhorn mountain over to a tower behind Fantasyland. And that cable is Disneyland's first piece of show action equipment.
Already with the big words there, Jim Shull, what exactly is show action equipment and why is it important?
The equipment is important because it's part of a system that allows a stunt to be performed safely and repeatedly. I mean, let's face it, for a film, a stunt only has to be done one time. After the camera captures what is needed, let's say like an actor, jumping off of rooftops or maybe setting themselves on fire, the director yells,
"Cut! Print!"
Ooh, very good. You have a history performance in you, Mr. Hill. But the performer moves on to the next stunt. However, when the stunt is part of a show performed in a theme park, that involves a completely different set of requirements. And that is because the stunt will be performed many times every day.
For example, at Disney MGM theme park during its first year of operation, guests could watch the Indiana Jones Epic Stunt Spectacular up to 9 times daily.
Which translates that in every single show, the giant ball had to roll through that temple. And in every single show, the sticks had to pop out from the floor. And again, in every single show, the actor Fine Indy had to be chopped into those little tiny fine pieces by the plane propeller.
It seems like there's always a want ad for that particular role in the Orlando Sentinel. When it comes to theme park stunt shows, what's important is delivering something that thrills the audience multiple times a day while ensuring that everyone is safe, right? That's what I'm getting at this.
Yeah, but you make it sound easy peasy, Len. I mean, the truth is that it took years to discover how to create and deliver stunt shows that are unique, safe, and repeatable. What was discovered over decades allowed Indiana Jones to avoid being crushed by the rolling ball or Jack Sparrow to jump into a windstorm and fly.
You mentioned this, Jim, and I've always had questions about it because I don't see any wires here.
That's the whole point of this episode of Disney Unpacked.
Okay, so Jim Shull, when did stunt shows begin in the Disney parks?
Well, Len, stunt shows have been presented at Disneyland since, forever. Picture this. It's the 1950s, and a family is calmly walking through Frontierland. Suddenly, they hear gun shooting, and they see Sheriff Lucky and Black Bart out on the street in a shootout. The sheriff and Mr. Black Bart appeared 4 times daily for their regularly scheduled gunfight. Remember, this is the 1950s, which is pre-pickleball. That's how you took out all your conflicts. This simple show always followed the same 3-act story. The two men met, they made pronouncements, and they fought. The climactic show moment was, if you can call it climactic, that was the moment when Sheriff Lucky shot Black Bart's gun right out of his hand. Bart would immediately surrender, and Sheriff Lucky would then march him off to jail. The end. That was the entire show. That was all you came to see, kids. Move on.
Wow. Okay, so judging by today's standards, that is a relatively simple and I would say maybe a little bit lame show.
The show got better when Wally Boag, the comic star of Disneyland's Golden Horseshoe Revue, would fill in as sheriff. I mean, Wally was I mean this in the kindest possible way, crazy.
It's how I describe you, Jim. It's kind of amazing. I'm glad you feel that way.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, well, good. I'm glad we got that settled. Continue.
Okay. Well, Mr. Boag would do things like he'd climb out the window of his dressing room, which I have to remind you guys, is located on the second floor of the Frontierland Theater, and then race along the rooftops as the sheriff pursued Black Bart.
Jim, that reminds me, there is this story that one day when Walt Disney was in Frontierland and he saw Boag's version of the stunt show, he reacted. We don't know, or never will know for certain, if Boag's planted the seed that day to use Frontierland's rooftops in a show. But soon, a show using those rooftops would appear.
How soon was that, Jim?
Let's see, that was in the spring of 1958. Oh, for the very first Zorro days.
All right, I know Jim Hill and I have talked about Zorro days, but remind me what they were again?
Well, the Old West was big business in the 1950s, and the Walt Disney Company was very much a part of that. A good example is that the company produced the Zorro television show, which debuted on the American Broadcasting Company in, help me out here, Jim.
That would have been October 10th, 1957.
And Zorro was immediately a hit show on ABC, and the very same children who were begging for J.V. Crockett coonskin hats, like me, all now wanted Zorro masks. So following the Disney playbook, they followed the triangle of success. And do you recall what a key component of the success is at Disney?
$6 sodas.
Len, you may have a 400 SAT, but the word you seek is synergy. The Disney company saw the success of Zorro as a merchandising opportunity and also as a way to boost Disneyland's attendance. A typical Zorro day would start with the television crew riding down Main Street, and then they lined up to sign autographs for all of the kids in their books. But this was just a warm-up for the Zorro stunt show.
And let me guess, this involved performances on the rooftops of Frontierland.
Len, indeed. Rooftops were involved, and the roofing contractors' unions rejoiced. But the big moment came when Zorro and the Commandant fought on the top deck of the Mark Twain steamship. Well, after much backing and forthing, Zorro would win, and the Commandant would jump into the rivers of America.
And it looks like even from that height, it would still kind of hurt.
Well, it's said that there is no pain when it's in the pursuit of art, Len. And if pain was involved, well, it didn't really matter because Disneyland guests, well, they loved the show. They loved it, which is why the park went on and presented Zorro Days 4 more times over the next 3 years.
That's true. They did it again in late May and late November of 1958, then again in late November of 59, and the final time in mid-November of 1960.
Jim, Shull, I also note here that with the Zorro mask covering more than half of the performer's face, you can get pretty much anyone who's tall enough to be a performer. And I'm guessing that the casting department must love that particular aspect of Zorro. Anyone with a sword can play.
Which couldn't be said about the performer who played Tinkerbell. I'm talking about the brave woman who used to jump off the Matterhorn. Tiny Cline, a 70-year-old aerialist who performed in Anaheim.
Anyone named Tiny was born to play Tinkerbell. But let me ask you, how did Tiny get that job?
Yeah, there's got to be a story where we ended up saying, you know what we should do? Push someone's grandmother off a 147-foot mountain.
Well, okay. All right, well...
There's a story there, I'm sure of it.
There is, gentlemen. There is. Okay, remember, we talked earlier about Walt having a great memory. Well, on August 1st, 1958, Disney Night was staged at the Hollywood Bowl. It was this star-studded affair where Fess Parker came out on stage wearing a coonskin cap as the orchestra then played the Ballad of Davy Crockett, and Guy Williams, dressed in a mask and a cape, appeared as the Zorro theme from the TV show was played.
And I'm assuming this was successful, Jim Hill?
That's what the press accounts of Disney Night at the Hollywood Bowl reported. But the moment that reportedly got the biggest reaction from the crowd there was when veteran circus aerialist Helen Deutsch, whose stage name was Tiny Cline, slid down a wire over the heads of the audience while dressed as Tinkerbell to the tune of When You Wish Upon a Star.
All right, so for this entire show, we get a sequence that lasts how long of Tinkerbell.
Oh my, at that speed, she was just up there a few seconds, Len. But it didn't really matter because her impact was huge. I mean, the emotional impact.
Her impact was huge. Interesting choice of words there, Jim Shull.
Well, subconscious moves in interesting, strange ways. But, moving on. There's a story that when Walt saw what Disneyland was planning for their very first fireworks show, he casually mentioned, it wouldn't be fun if we started the show with Tinkerbell flying over Sleeping Beauty's castle.
That's interesting because is there anything at this point in the park that's higher than Sleeping Beauty's castle that will allow Tinkerbell to fly over it?
Well, Matterhorn did open in June, in fact, June 15th, 1959.
And when was the first Fantasy in the Sky presented?
I got to tell you, Len, I'm not sure about this one. The closest I can come to an exact start date for that show is the summer of 1961.
Well, dates aside, now the Disneyland mobilized, and they went through the steps of staging the thing that Walt wanted. So they hired Tiny, and they built the show action equipment, which in this case was a cable.
A cable that she slid down, according to Jim Hill, at 30 miles an hour.
That's the speed she traveled at, and her flight ended every night with her then smashing into the taco.
Okay. It just generates questions. The taco?
Picture this. Two guys held up a mattress that was used to stop Ms. Cline at the end of the flight. When Tiny flew into the mattress with such force, it would fold in on itself.
All right. And then they threw guacamole on her to cool her off.
I actually got to talk to one of these guys, the ones who acted as Ms. Cline's catcher up there in the tower. And she supposedly tipped each of these guys $5 for every successful catch, which, by the way, big money back in the early 1960s for just a few seconds of work. And reportedly, there were guys at Disneyland back in the day who used to fight for this gig to be, hold up one end of the mattress, as Tiny came sliding in.
Ms. Cline continued her role as Tinkerbell for a few more years, but eventually the pixie dust was passed on and the taco was filled by someone else.
That's true. Because remember here, Tink wasn't the only Disney character to jump off the Matterhorn. There's been a number of them over the years. What was it? Mary Poppins flew over the castle at one point.
Right. Baymax, the entire house from the film Up. And Jim, I know you're saying that we're talking about characters that flew over the castle, but one was pushed, and that's Baby Do Year.
That's a great story.
Many characters flew. Only one was pushed. All right.
But let's not forget that also another character who flew up there in 1995 was Indiana Jones. And he jumped off the Matterhorn, sliding down that same cable to promote his new Adventureland ride.
Jim Shull, since you bring up Indiana Jones, doesn't the MGM Studios show for Indiana Jones open up in Walt Disney World around this time?
The Indiana Jones Epic Stunt Spectacular, that actually opened 6 years before the Indiana Jones Adventure Ride opened at Disneyland. And by the way, it holds the honor of being the first real permanent stunt show done at a Disney park. The prior shows, such as Zorro, well, they took advantage of pre-existing facilities, where Indy, it had a dedicated amphitheater with seating for, 2,000 people?
Yeah, and it was a permanent facility, and it allowed Disney Entertainment and WDI to create something brand new for the company because it was the first to use actual show systems. Take, for example, this scene where Marion gets grabbed off the street in Morocco and then is thrown into the back of a truck, which suddenly explodes, which makes Indy mistakenly think that, Marion is dead.
Like I say, the number of people who must audition for the show on a daily basis is astronomical. Anyway, what does this have to do with show systems?
When Steven Spielberg was shooting that same scene for the first Indy film, he had professional stunt performers and a safety team, and he told them you only had to do it once. You only have one chance at it, and once you do it, you get the shot and you move on to the next shot. However, recreating the now classic scene for a theme park show and doing it multiple times every day, there were a different set of circumstances. Now the truck had to flip over and explode, well, multiple times a day. And that's not easy to pull off. So the solution is a system, hence the name show system.
Now, can you explain how this moment from Raiders is recreated in the epic stunt show?
That scene starts off with a real truck. Guests watch the stunt performer playing Marion being thrown into the back of that vehicle. And when that truck drives out of sight behind the buildings that make up the Moroccan street set, that truck's gone. But seconds later, a vehicle that looks exactly like the truck that Marion was thrown into, it drives out from behind those very same sets. Well, after a moment, in surprise, Indy fires a shot from his pistol toward the truck, and it flips over and explodes. Combined, these pieces recreate the memorable moment from Raiders live for the guests and the audience.
And not only that, but if I recall the show, the stunt performer who played Marion, who we saw thrown into the truck, now hops out of the back of the flip truck and completely unscathed. And the audience marvels at how this was pulled off.
I'm guessing here it's not the same truck in both scenes.
Mm-hmm.
Did I check the license plates? I got the jury's out on that. This truck looks like the same truck, but it's not the same truck.
Mm-hmm.
This truck doesn't even drive on the ground. The wheels don't touch the surface because this second truck runs on a hidden rail. And in seeming response to Indy firing his gun, there's a rotation mechanism inside the track that is then activated by the director in the booth that turns the truck over, flipping it.
Okay, so the truck, the rail, and the rotating mechanism is one example of a show system.
Now, Disney MGM has a stunt show that's a hit attraction. And what does Disney do when they have a hit attraction?
Raise prices. No. Well, yes. Yes, and. Yes, and.
Yes, and. Okay.
Yes, and. They, my guess is they look for other stunt shows to build.
To raise prices there? I mean, to build more. They build more. That's the answer. So the next step for Indy was the obvious one. They go build more, or at least they start planning to build more.
And, what's kind of interesting is that the folks at Glendale at this time were designing 2 new theme parks that could feature the Indy stunt show.
More studio-themed theme parks, Jim?
Yes, indeed. One of the new studio parks was going to be the second park at Tokyo Disney. I heard the working title for this project was Disney's Hollywood Fantasy.
Oof. And that would have been in place of Disney Seas?
Yeah, that early on, that's Michael Eisner really wanted the Japanese to build a second studio park. The Disney company is all in at this point, planning studio theme parks. In fact, before Euro Disneyland opened, the company announced that Paris would soon be getting a second park, and that park would be named Disney MGM Studios Europe.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there's a huge marketing push. I mean, they weren't opening the first one before they announced, oh my goodness, there's going to be another one opening right next door in 1994.
And both of these studio parks were supposed to have their own versions of the Indiana Jones epic stunt show?
Well, yes, but a big no, because they weren't just going
yes,
to be
but no.
of...
It's the most French thing you could say, Jim Shull. Yes, but no. Yes, but also no.
These were not going to be copies of Orlando because remember, Indy was a huge hit. And when you have a hit, you want to copy it, but you also want to go bigger. And so release video from marketing at Disney talks about the fact that the one Indy show in Paris was going to be set on a massive lagoon. It was going to be its own mini land. And it would have things like, it'd have the aircraft hangar, and that would be the show's amphitheater. There'd be the actual Moroccan village, and on the water would be a seaplane.
Was this going to be Jock Lindsay's seaplane?
Well, if we look really, really close, the images do support that Jock owned that seaplane.
Oh my God! So that's how we got Jock Lindsay's hangar bar, and how it would be. Well, you could expand that to every park then.
Well, I cannot disagree, and an idea may take a long time, a generation, at least years, to come to fruition in a Disney park, but it did start here.
Were they also thinking of the hangar bar at this time, or was it just the stunt show?
When the time finally came, that was no longer an option, Len.
Jim, I feel like I've tried to kick a football that Lucy has pulled out from under me. We know that they never built Disney MGM Studios Europe, but why?
Well, there are a lot of reasons. But let's just say that by the time Disney's second theme park finally did open in France in March of 2002, they'd picked a different direction.
Didn't I hear that there was going to be an Indiana Jones show in California as well?
Now you're talking about something I know a little bit more about, because you're talking about the other stunt spectacular, the one that was stated for Anaheim, the show that would have featured the younger version of Indy seen in the opening moments of the film Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
Oh, this is the River Phoenix version of Indy. That's some with Boy Scouts, grave robbers, and what's it? A circus train?
Everything is better with circus trains, and all of that was in the opening sequence of Last Crusade. So let's talk about story logic for a moment. If you walk out the story logic, those scenes in that movie were set in 1912 Utah, and therefore a stunt show based on young Indy fits not in Adventureland, but in Frontierland.
Oh, okay. But the next question is, where in Frontierland you're going to build that kind of theater?
Well, it's a really different world in California than it is in Orlando. So you couldn't build an amphitheater, because an amphitheater like the one in Orlando, well, it has a roof, but it doesn't have sides. And the sides are what keep the noise from the stunt show inside the building. So without the sides, you would have all of those explosions and all that noise broadcast right into the surrounding neighborhoods. And the people who live in those little tract houses, they're not really happy with that.
Okay, so you need a building, like a box-sized building.
Not a box, Len. Indy would be in a tent, a circus tent.
The world's biggest yurt. Okay, Jim, where is this tent going?
The yurt would go where the Festival of Fools Theater was located in 1996.
This is where Disneyland's Hunchback of Notre Dame show was located. Out behind Big Thunder Ranch, this is ultimately where the Anaheim version of Galaxy's Edge was built.
Yeah.
Exactly. The planned site would have been right up against the berm next to the Disneyland Railroad. And the art that was been released shows that the plan for the Young Indy stunt show was to leverage the railroad by adding a spur track, and the circus train would run on this spur track.
Really? So they'd have multiple trains on the train track. Okay, you've got my interest. How would this have worked?
Well, the circus train, let's face it, it's such an iconic Last Crusade moment. If you're sitting in the stadium, in the box, tent, watching the train engine crash right through the side with young Indy aboard, they would have experienced for themselves, I just can't believe what I saw moment.
It sounds amazing, but I'm assuming that there were difficulties in either budget or in execution that caused this not to happen. Why wasn't it built?
This was one of the projects that was announced for the Disney decade. And Young Indiana Jones Epic Stunt Spectacular was supposed to be one of the first, but very few of the projects that has a Disney decade ever got built. Like, big events like world economic downturn and Euro Disney's financial struggles got in the way. And, in the end, that's why the train never smashed into the circus tent.
Yurt.
Sorry.
However, Disneyland did actually open something with Indy. They opened the Indiana Jones Adventure. So, that e-ticket classic ride did come to Disneyland. It went to Adventureland. So we got that, if not a stunt show.
Wait, hold on. So we gave up a train full of circus monkeys for
a giant animatronic snake, which, by the way, now works.
But Len, a unique experience defines Eye of the Storm, Captain Jack's Epic Stunt Spectacular. The show was something the Chinese had never seen before, making it unique. But they might have seen the technology behind the showstopper stunt. You two are familiar with the I Fly, aren't you?
The attraction I drive, the indoor skydiving thing, that's what powers Eye of the Storm?
Yeah, that's it. The technology is basically the same, except the person flying isn't wearing a flying squirrel suit and an eye mask. It's just the performer jumping head first into a really big, sharp fan.
I've actually done this iFly in Orlando, and let me just say that sliding on a cable in Disneyland is sounding better and better every day.
Yeah, you and me both. But before Captain Jack can fly in Shanghai, he's got to take off. So let's stop for a moment and look at this moment of a two-story piece of show equipment that Captain Jack and his protagonist is standing on. This platform is then what moves Jack and his opponent into the position for their flight.
Oh, this is similar to the flipping truck over at Indiana Jones. There's the show equipment right there in plain sight.
Len, hearing you say that does my heart good. My work is done.
Well, that does it for this show on the history of stunt shows at the Disney theme parks. What's on our next show?
Since we were just talking about that flipping truck in Epic Stunt Spectacular, why don't we keep the Cars theme going and talk about Mater's Junkyard Jamboree and his offspring all around the world?
That works for me. All right, until then, for Jim Hill and Jim Shull, it's me, Len Testa. Thanks for watching.
Jim Hill here. If you've been enjoying Disney Unpacked on YouTube, be sure and head on over to Patreon and join our community. Not only will you receive the entire Jim Hill Media suite of podcasts ad-free, but you'll also get bonus episodes of the Disney Dish and, more importantly, the full episodes of Disney Unpacked with more stories from Jim Shull, Len Testa, and I. By joining our Patreon, you are helping us continue to evolve our entertainment offerings and are part of the team. We can't wait to show you some of the other ideas we've been working on. And if you haven't yet, be sure and subscribe to Disney Unpacked on YouTube. Thanks for watching and supporting the team at Jim Hill Media and Disney Unpacked.